The diamond catches the candlelight like captured starfire, but nothing glitters more than the love burning in his eyes as he slides it around my throat. Yet even paradise casts shadows when you look closely enough to see them. Tara Davis had always believed that fairy tales were just stories parents told children to help them sleep. But as she stood in the floor-to-ceiling windows of their Manhattan penthouse, watching the city lights dance below, while Marvin's hands gently fastened the most exquisite diamond necklace she'd ever seen around her throat, she knew that sometimes fairy tales did come true, even if the prince sometimes wondered whether he deserved his kingdom. 5 years, Marvin whispered against her ear, his breath warm and familiar. At 32, he had built an empire from nothing, but tonight, dressed in his perfectly tailored black suit, he looked at her with something that mixed adoration with a shadow she'd learned not to examine too closely. 5 incredible years of calling you my wife. Tara, 30 years old and radiant in her emerald silk dress, felt her heart flutter the same way it had 7 years ago when they first met. She turned in his arms, her dark skin glowing in the candlelight, her natural curls perfectly framing her face. "Has it really been that long since you swept me off my feet at that business conference in Chicago?" 7 years since I saw you giving that presentation on digital marketing strategies and knew I had to know the brilliant woman behind those ideas, Marvin said, though something in his voice carried the weight of a man still amazed that someone like Tara had chosen someone like him. "And 5 years since you said yes to forever." The penthouse around them told the story of their journey together, but also of careful compromises Tara had made without fully realizing it. The minimalist design was Marvin's preference, the neutral colors chosen to complement his taste rather than her love of bold jewel tones. Every piece had been selected together, but looking back, Tara realized together had often meant her deferring to his vision of sophistication. "Do you remember what you said when you proposed?" Tara asked, her fingers tracing the lapels of his jacket. Marvin's smile grew tender, but there was something vulnerable beneath it, the expression of a man who still couldn't quite believe he'd won the lottery. "I said that I'd spent my whole life building businesses, but I wanted to spend the rest of it building a love story with you. And I said yes because you were the first man who saw my mind before my beauty, my dreams before my curves." It was true, but she remembered the night he'd introduced her at the Tech Leaders Summit 6 months ago. "This is my wife Tara, the real brains behind Durantech's marketing revolution," he'd said, and while others had complimented her brilliance, she'd noticed how his chest had puffed with pride, as if her accomplishments were reflections of his good judgment in choosing her. He spun her around slowly, and she laughed, the sound filling their home with joy. The diamond necklace caught the light again, heavy and expensive against her throat. Beautiful gifts had become Marvin's way of expressing feelings he struggled to voice directly, as if he believed he had to keep proving his worthiness through material gestures. "I still can't believe you chose me," she said softly, and watched his face brighten the way it always did when she expressed gratitude for his love rather than simply accepting it as her due. "Chose you?" Marvin pulled her closer, his relief at her words barely hidden behind his conviction. "Tara, you weren't a choice. You were destiny. From the moment you challenged my ideas in that conference room, refusing to be impressed by my success until I proved my worth through my mind, I knew my search was over." But even as he said the words, Tara sometimes wondered if he loved her brilliance because it reflected well on him, or because he genuinely valued her mind. The distinction mattered, though she'd never allowed herself to examine it too closely. They had built their empire together, though the division of labor had shifted subtly over the years. While Marvin's company Durantech had made them wealthy, it was Tara's marketing genius that had transformed his technical innovations into cultural phenomena. She'd left her corporate job 3 years into their marriage to become his partner in business as well as life, telling herself it was romantic rather than acknowledging she was subordinating her career to his. "Remember our first apartment?" Tara asked as they swayed to the soft jazz playing from their sound system. "That tiny place in Brooklyn where we could barely fit a queen bed?" Marvin chuckled. "You made it feel like a palace. You hung those string lights everywhere and somehow made a studio apartment feel like home." "We were so poor but so rich," Tara said, though she remembered feeling more independent then, more herself. She'd had her own job, her own income, her own dreams that weren't automatically secondary to his. "You made me feel like I could conquer the world," Marvin said. And there it was again, the need for her to make him feel worthy, rather than him simply being worthy on his own. Still do. Now their wealth was vast. Multiple homes, luxury cars, investment portfolios that most people could only dream of. But sometimes, in quiet moments like this, Tara wondered when abundance had started feeling like beautiful bondage, when being cherished had begun to feel like being collected. "Dance with me," Marvin said, though they were already swaying together. He led her to the center of their living room, where moonlight streamed through the windows. Their wedding song began to play, "All of Me," by John Legend. Marvin had chosen it because the lyrics captured how he felt about her, but lately, Tara had begun to notice how the song was about loving someone's flaws rather than celebrating their strengths. As they danced, she remembered their wedding day 5 years ago. Marvin had cried when she walked down the aisle in her grandmother's vintage lace dress, but she'd also noticed how he'd subtly directed the photographer to capture his emotion rather than simply feeling it privately. Even their most intimate moments sometimes felt performed, as if their love needed an audience to validate it. "What are you thinking about?" Marvin asked, noticing the distant look in her eyes. "Our wedding day. How perfect everything was." "Perfect," he agreed, but his tone carried the weight of someone trying to convince himself as much as her. "We were perfect. We are perfect." The repetition felt like an incantation, as if saying it enough times would make it unshakably true. They had weathered storms together. His business struggles, her miscarriage 2 years ago, the subtle racism they sometimes encountered as an interracial couple in elite circles. But they'd faced everything hand in hand, even if Tara had increasingly found herself adapting to fit his needs rather than him accommodating hers. "I have something else for you," Marvin said, reaching into his jacket pocket with the nervous energy of a man who expressed love through gestures because words felt inadequate. "The necklace wasn't enough?" Tara laughed, though part of her wished for one anniversary gift that wasn't about what he could buy, but what he could create or sacrifice for her. "Close your eyes," she obeyed, feeling him place something small in her palm. When she opened her eyes, she found a small velvet box containing a key. "What's this for?" "The lake house in upstate New York. I bought it yesterday. Our own private retreat where we can escape whenever the world gets too loud." The gesture was beautiful and thoughtful, but Tara couldn't help noticing that he'd bought it without consulting her, making another major life decision as if her opinion was assumed rather than requested. "Marvin, it's lovely, but you didn't need to." "I wanted to. I want to give you everything, Tara. You deserve the world." But his voice carried the undertone of a man trying to prove something rather than simply sharing something. She kissed him then, tasting the champagne they'd shared and trying to recapture the pure joy she'd once felt in moments like this. When they broke apart, both were breathless, but Tara couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental was shifting between them. "I love you so much it scares me sometimes," she admitted. "Scares you how?" "Because you have all of me, Marvin. every piece of my heart, every dream in my head, every hope for the future. Sometimes I wonder if that's healthy, giving someone so much power over your happiness. You have the same power over me, he said, but they both knew it wasn't quite true. She'd structured her life around their marriage. He'd structured their marriage around his ambitions. Promise me something, she said as they moved toward their bedroom. Anything. Promise me that if you ever feel like this isn't enough, like I'm not enough, you'll tell me. Don't let resentment build. Don't let curiosity about other lives poison what we have. Marvin's step faltered almost imperceptibly. The question was too close to thoughts he'd been having but hadn't dared voice, wondering what his life might have looked like if he'd made different choices, if he'd pursued the kind of dangerous, passionate relationships his single friends seemed to thrive on. Why would you ask that? He said, deflecting rather than promising. Because I see how you look sometimes at couples who fight and make up, who have dramatic breakups and passionate reunions, like you wonder what that intensity would feel like. What we have is better than drama, he said, but his voice lacked conviction. What we have is real. Yes, Tara agreed, but as they reached their bedroom, she couldn't shake the feeling that real had somehow become another word for predictable in Marvin's mind. They made love with the passion of people who knew each other's bodies perfectly, but afterward, as they lay entwined in their silk sheets, Tara found herself staring at the ceiling and wondering when physical intimacy had started feeling like emotional distance. "Are you happy?" she asked quietly into the darkness. "Of course I'm happy," Marvin replied too quickly. "Why wouldn't I be happy? I have everything: successful business, beautiful wife, perfect life." But everything sounded like a list of achievements rather than a celebration of joy, and perfect felt like a pressure rather than a blessing. "Sometimes perfect can feel limiting," Tara said carefully. "What do you mean?" "Nothing," she said, not ready to examine the thought further. "Just wondering if we ever miss the excitement of uncertainty, of not knowing what comes next." Marvin was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence, Tara heard the answer he wasn't brave enough to speak. They both missed something they couldn't name. Not each other, but earlier versions of themselves that had felt more alive, more unpredictable, more dangerous. "We have everything we ever wanted," he said finally, but it sounded like he was trying to convince himself. As Tara drifted off to sleep in her husband's arms, she felt the weight of perfection settling around them like a beautiful cage. Their home was perfect. Their love was perfect. Their future stretching ahead of them was perfect. But perfection, she was beginning to understand, was a dangerous thing to achieve when you were still young enough to crave chaos, still human enough to wonder what you might have missed in your rush to build something stable. She had no way of knowing that the man whose heartbeat she was falling asleep to was already dreaming of golden silk and the intoxicating scent of danger that smelled nothing like vanilla candles and familiar perfume. Tomorrow would bring new challenges to their perfect love, testing whether a marriage built on mutual admiration could survive when one person started mistaking gratitude for passion, and the other began wondering if being cherished was the same thing as being truly wanted. Chapter 2. The Dream Woman. Some people enter your life like natural disasters, beautiful, devastating, and impossible to prepare for, no matter how stable you think your world has become. 2 weeks after their perfect anniversary night, Marvin Duran adjusted his platinum cufflinks as he stepped out of his black Bentley at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. The annual Tech Innovation Gala was the event of the season, where New York's most powerful minds gathered to celebrate breakthrough achievements and measure their success against their peers. "Mr. Duran, congratulations on the Forbes feature," his driver Thomas said as he held the door. "Will Mrs. Duran be joining you tonight?" "She's in Chicago closing the Morrison account," Marvin replied, straightening his black tie. The truth was more complicated. He'd encouraged Tara to take the business trip even though she'd wanted to accompany him tonight. Lately, these high society events had begun feeling like performances where he played the role of the successful tech mogul while battling a growing sense that everyone could see through his facade. The imposter syndrome had been getting worse. Surrounded by old money families and Ivy League connections, Marvin sometimes felt like the scholarship kid from Detroit who'd clawed his way to the top through sheer determination rather than inherited privilege. Tara's presence usually steadied him. Her brilliance was undeniable, her confidence authentic, but tonight, facing the crowd alone, he felt exposed. Inside the museum's grand hall, crystal chandeliers cast prisms of light across marble floors where Manhattan's elite mingled beneath priceless works of art. Marvin moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his presence commanding attention even as a voice in his head wondered how long he could maintain the illusion of belonging in this world. "Marvin," called Jonathan Wright, CEO of Wright Industries. "Brilliant work on the latest software update, though we all know the real genius behind your marketing strategies is that wife of yours." The comment was meant as a compliment, but it hit Marvin like a familiar sting. How many times had his success been attributed to Tara's contributions? How often did people assume his achievements were really hers? He loved his wife's brilliance, was grateful for her partnership, but sometimes he wondered if he'd become a supporting character in his own success story. "She's incredible," he replied automatically, the response he'd perfected over years of similar conversations. As he accepted congratulations and made small talk, Marvin felt that familiar restlessness growing. The same feeling that had been building for months, a sense that his life, perfect as it appeared, had become a carefully constructed performance rather than an authentic existence. He loved Tara deeply, but their love had settled into patterns that felt more like a successful business partnership than the passionate romance he'd once imagined marriage would be. That's when he saw her. She stood near the Impressionist paintings, and Marvin's first thought was that she looked like she'd stepped out of one of the artworks herself, ethereal, untouchable, beautiful, in a way that seemed almost otherworldly. Her long blonde hair caught the gallery lighting like spun gold, and her figure in the silver dress was the kind that made grown men forget their own names. But it was something else about her that stopped him cold. A vulnerability in her posture, despite her obvious beauty, as if she was used to being looked at, but not used to being seen. "Magnificent, isn't it?" a voice like honey said beside him. Marvin turned to find the golden goddess herself standing next to him, studying the same Monet he'd been pretending to examine. Up close, she was even more stunning, but also more complex than he'd expected. Her blue eyes held depths that spoke of experiences beyond her apparent youth, and her smile, while captivating, carried shadows that suggested she'd learned to weaponize her beauty out of necessity rather than vanity. "The painting or the evening," he managed to say. "Both have their illusions," she replied, extending a perfectly manicured hand. "Elisha Monroe. And you're Marvin Duran. I've been hoping to meet you." Her handshake was firm, professional, but her skin was soft as silk against his palm. "You know my work. Your innovations in artificial intelligence are fascinating. But more than that." She paused, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel both flattered and exposed. "You have the look of someone who fought for their seat at the table," she said, studying his face with an intensity that made him feel both flattered and exposed. "I recognize it because I see the same thing in my own mirror every morning." The observation was so accurate it nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. "What makes you say that?" "The way you hold yourself. Confident enough to command respect, but with just enough caution to suggest you remember when respect was something you had to fight for." Elisha's smile grew more genuine. "Old money carries itself differently. It assumes it belongs everywhere. New money proves it belongs everywhere. "And which are you?" Marvin asked, genuinely curious despite himself. "Neither," Alicia said with a laugh that held no humor. "I'm someone who learned to navigate this world without a safety net." She gestured to the elegant crowd around them. "When you grow up in the system, you learn to read people quickly. Survival depends on it." "The system?" "Foster care." The words were matter-of-fact, but Marvin caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "You learn that beauty opens doors that other qualities can't budge, and you learn to use every advantage you're given." Her directness surprised him, but it also explained the careful way she held herself, as if always ready to adapt to whatever response her honesty provoked. The casual mention of foster care hit him like a revelation. This wasn't just a beautiful socialite looking for her next wealthy conquest. This was someone who'd learned to navigate elite circles as a matter of survival, using her extraordinary beauty as armor against a world that had never offered her safety. "Foster care," he repeated, his tone gentle with understanding. 16 different homes between ages 6 and 18, she said matter-of-factly. "Some kind, some tolerable, some—" She shrugged elegantly. "You learn that beauty opens doors that intelligence and kindness can't budge. You learn to use every advantage the universe gives you because you never know when they'll disappear." Marvin felt something shift in his chest. This wasn't the predatory seductress he'd initially assumed. This was someone who'd clawed her way into this world through sheer determination, just like he had. That must have been incredibly difficult. "It taught me to recognize strength in others," Alicia said, her eyes studying him with new appreciation. "Most people born into privilege mistake comfort for happiness. But those of us who built ourselves from nothing, we understand that real satisfaction comes from conquering challenges, not avoiding them." The conversation was unlike anything he'd experienced at these events. While others discussed stock portfolios and vacation homes, Alicia was talking about survival and strength and the psychology of success. It reminded him of early conversations with Tara, before their relationship had settled into comfortable patterns of mutual admiration. "I should rejoin my colleagues," Marvin said, though he made no move to leave. "Should," Alicia repeated thoughtfully. Such an interesting word. It implies duty over desire, obligation over choice. Do you find yourself using it often? What do you mean? I mean, when was the last time you did something purely because you wanted to, not because you should? When did you last take a risk that scared you? The question echoed conversations he'd been avoiding having with himself. When had his life become a series of shoulds rather than wants? When had he stopped making choices based on desire and started making them based on expectations? "I take risks every day in business," he said. "Calculated risks with safety nets," Alicia corrected gently. "I'm talking about emotional risks, the kind where you might lose everything if you're wrong, but gain everything if you're right. That sounds like a dangerous way to live." "It's the only way I know how to live," she said simply. "When you've lost everything multiple times, you learn that safety is an illusion anyway. The only real security comes from trusting yourself to survive whatever happens." Before he could respond, she reached into her small evening purse and pulled out a card, pressing it into his hand. "I'm in the city for another month, working on a photography project about success and survival. If you ever want to talk to someone who understands what it's like to build yourself from nothing and wonder if the person you've become is who you really are." She started to walk away, then paused. "Your wife sounds incredible, by the way. The kind of woman who supports your dreams because she loves you, not because she needs you. That's rare. How do you know about Tara?" "I research everyone worth knowing in this city. She's accomplished, beautiful, devoted, everything a smart man should want." Alicia's smile was sad rather than seductive. The question is whether being everything someone should want is the same as being what they actually need. With that enigmatic statement, she disappeared into the crowd, leaving Marvin standing alone beside the Monet with his worldview quietly imploding. He didn't look at her card immediately. Instead, he found the bar and ordered a scotch, neat, the way he'd drunk it in college before Tara had introduced him to wine and sophistication and the finer things in life. The alcohol burned, but not as much as the realization that he couldn't immediately answer whether his wife was what he needed or what he'd been told he should need. When he finally glanced at the card, elegant script on cream paper read, "Elisha Monroe, for conversations about building yourself into someone worth becoming." His phone buzzed with a text from Tara. "Missing you tonight. Can't wait to hear all about the gala. The Morrison deal is almost closed. Love you endlessly." The message should have filled him with warmth and pride. Instead, it highlighted the difference between the woman who loved him for who he was and the woman who challenged him to examine who he'd become. Tara's love felt safe, comfortable, assumed. Elisha's attention felt dangerous, unpredictable, earned. "You look like a man wrestling with complicated thoughts," said David Kim, appearing beside him at the bar with a knowing smile. "Just processing the evening," Marvin replied, slipping Elisha's card into his jacket pocket before David could see it. "Lot of interesting people here tonight. I saw you talking to that blonde woman by the paintings. Elisha something. She's been making waves in the modeling world lately." "Just networking," Marvin said, but his voice sounded hollow even to himself. "Course," David agreed, though his tone suggested he'd noticed more than Marvin was comfortable with. "How's Tara? Still the genius behind your marketing magic?" "She's in Chicago," Marvin said, avoiding the question about her role in his success. "Closing a major deal." "Lucky man," David said, and Marvin wasn't sure if he meant lucky to have Tara or lucky that she wasn't here to witness his obvious attraction to another woman. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of familiar conversations and forced smiles. Marvin played his role perfectly, but his mind kept drifting to blue eyes that had seen too much, to conversations about survival and authenticity, to the intoxicating possibility of knowing someone who'd built herself from nothing and understood the weight of constantly proving your worth. When he finally returned home to their penthouse, the silence felt deafening. No jazz music, no vanilla candles, no soft laughter from the woman who made their house feel like home. Just empty rooms filled with expensive furniture and the echo of his own footsteps. He sat in his study, Elisha's card on his desk like a small white flag of surrender, and forced himself to confront the question that had been eating at him for months. Was he grateful for Tara's love, or truly fulfilled by it? Was their marriage a beautiful achievement, or a comfortable prison he'd built for himself? As the city lights blurred outside his window and the weight of perfection pressed down like a physical force, Marvin Duran began to understand the difference between having everything you're supposed to want and actually wanting everything you have. Chapter 3. The Confession. The truth arrives wearing the mask of honesty, promising to set you free while quietly destroying everything you've built your happiness on. Marvin stood outside their penthouse door at midnight, his key frozen in his hand as he wrestled with thoughts that felt like betrayal just for existing. The drive home from the gala had been torture, 40 minutes of city traffic while Elisha's words echoed in his mind like a virus he couldn't delete. When was the last time you did something purely because you wanted to, not because you should? The question had unlocked something dangerous in his chest, a restlessness that felt like suffocating in reverse. Not the absence of air, but too much of the wrong kind, the safe kind that kept him alive but never made him feel truly awake. He finally unlocked the door and stepped into their sanctuary, immediately enveloped by everything that represented home. Jazz music playing softly, vanilla candles casting warm light across their living room, the familiar scent of Tara's perfume lingering in the air like a promise of comfort and love. "Marvin," her voice called from their bedroom, rich with relief and something else. Concern, perhaps, for the way he'd been distant since she'd returned from Chicago 2 days ago. "I was starting to worry." He found her curled in their king-sized bed, wearing one of his old Princeton t-shirts that somehow looked more elegant on her than any designer nightgown. At 30, Tara possessed a natural grace that made expensive things seem ordinary, and ordinary things seem precious. Her dark curls were pulled back loosely, her face free of makeup, and she looked so beautiful and trusting that his chest ached with guilt for the thoughts he couldn't silence. "How was the gala?" she asked, setting aside the marketing journal she'd been reading. Even during her downtime, she was working, not because he pressured her, but because she genuinely loved the intellectual challenge of understanding human behavior and translating it into successful campaigns. "Educational," he said, the word tasting like copper in his mouth. "Meet anyone interesting?" The question was innocent, conversational, but something in his expression made her dark eyes sharpen with concern. Marvin sat heavily on the edge of their bed, and Tara immediately moved closer, her hand finding his shoulder with the instinctive comfort of someone who'd spent years learning to read his moods and respond to his needs. "I need to tell you about something that happened tonight," he said finally. "Okay," she said softly, though her hand stilled against his back. "I met someone. A woman." The words felt like stepping off a cliff. "And I can't get her out of my head." "What do you mean you can't get her out of your head?" "I mean I keep thinking about her, about what she said, how she made me feel." He was fumbling now, unable to articulate the complexity of his attraction without sounding like either a cheater or a fool. "She reminded me of who I used to be." The silence that followed stretched like a wire pulled too tight. Tara's hand didn't move away from his shoulder, but he could feel the tension coiling through her body. "Can't stop thinking about her, how?" Her voice was carefully controlled, the tone she used in business negotiations when she needed to gather information before reacting. "Who you used to be." Her voice was carefully controlled, but he could hear the danger beneath it. "Before I became this," he gestured helplessly at their expensive surroundings. "Before I became the perfect husband with the perfect life who never takes risks anymore." "So this woman represents risk?" "She represents—" He struggled to find words that wouldn't destroy everything. "Freedom, I suppose. The feeling of not knowing what comes next." "And our marriage doesn't give you that feeling?" "Our marriage gives me security," he said, and immediately regretted the choice of words when her face went completely still. "Security," she repeated slowly. "Not joy. Not excitement. Not love. Security. Dying how?" Her question came out as a whisper, like I've become this perfect version of myself that everyone expects. The successful husband, the tech mogul, the man who has everything figured out. But I don't recognize myself anymore. When did I stop being someone who surprised people? When did I become so predictable? Tara was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice carried hurt and recognition in equal measure. "When did being married to me start feeling like a limitation instead of a partnership?" "That's not what I meant, isn't it?" She pulled back to study his face, her intelligence cutting through his careful words to the truth beneath. "You're telling me that this woman represents freedom, excitement, danger, everything our marriage apparently isn't. Our marriage is beautiful." he said desperately. It's stable and supportive and everything I should want. Should again, Tara interrupted, her voice growing stronger. You keep using that word, Marvin. Should love me, should want this life, should be grateful for what we've built. When did our love become an obligation instead of a choice? The accusation stung because it contained an uncomfortable grain of truth. Somewhere along the way, their relationship had become something he maintained rather than something he celebrated. Not because he loved her less, but because loving her had become as automatic as breathing, necessary for survival, but no longer consciously appreciated. I don't know how to want what I have, he admitted, the confession ripping from his chest like a physical wound. I know I'm supposed to be grateful, supposed to be satisfied, supposed to cherish what we've built together. But there's this voice in my head asking what else is out there, what other versions of myself I might have become. And this woman, Elisha, she represents those other versions? She represents not knowing what comes next, he said honestly. Not having everything planned and perfect and safe. She makes me feel like I did when I was 25, and hungry for something I couldn't name. Tara was quiet for so long that Marvin began to hope she might understand, might find a way to help him work through this crisis without destroying everything they'd built together. What exactly are you asking me? She said finally. This was the moment of choice. He could retreat, apologize, pretend this conversation had never happened, and bury his restlessness deeper. Or he could be completely honest about desires that felt like betrayal just for existing. I need to know what it feels like to be with her, he said quietly. Just once. Just long enough to prove to myself that what we have is worth more than any fantasy. The words landed like physical blows. Tara's face went through a series of expressions: shock, pain, disbelief, and finally something that looked like she was watching him die in front of her. You want to sleep with another woman to prove you love me? Her voice was hollow, distant. I want to get her out of my system so I can come home to you knowing I chose you over everything else, he said desperately. Not because it's safe or expected or comfortable, but because after experiencing what else is out there, you're still what I want most. And if you discover she's what you want most. That won't happen, he said with more conviction than he felt. Because what we have is real, Tara. It's built on years of love and partnership and shared dreams. She's just curiosity, fantasy, the road not taken. The road not taken, Tara repeated slowly, and he could see her brilliant mind working through the implications. So our marriage, our love, our life together, that's the road you settled for, instead of the one you actually wanted to walk. No, that's not. Then what? She stood up from the bed with sudden energy, pacing to their bedroom window. Explain to me how asking permission to betray our marriage vows is somehow an expression of love. Marvin followed her, desperate to make her understand something he barely understood himself. Because I'm being honest with you instead of lying. Because I'm asking for your blessing instead of sneaking around behind your back. How generous of you, she said, her voice gaining an edge he'd rarely heard. You want credit for asking permission to destroy my trust instead of just destroying it in secret. I want to know that when I choose you, it's because you're irreplaceable, not because you're convenient. The words came out wrong, harsh and cruel when he'd meant them to be reassuring. Tara's face went completely still, and he realized with growing horror that he'd just reduced their 5 years of marriage to a question of convenience. Irreplaceable, she said slowly. You need to sleep with someone else to determine whether your wife is irreplaceable. Tara, no. Her voice cut through his attempted explanation like a blade. Let me see if I understand this correctly. You've met a woman who makes you feel young and dangerous and alive, feelings that apparently our marriage has killed. And rather than examining why you're bored with love that most people spend their entire lives trying to find, you've decided the solution is to satisfy your curiosity with her, then return to me with the wisdom that I'm still your best option. When she put it like that, his reasoning sounded selfish and cruel, but he couldn't deny the essential truth of it. I know it sounds terrible when you say it like that. It sounds terrible because it is terrible, she said, turning to face him with eyes that held more pain than anger. Do you have any idea what you're asking me to live with? Knowing that you had to sample other women to decide I was worth keeping. It's not about sampling. Then what is it about, Marvin? Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you've grown tired of a wife who supports your dreams, shares your bed, and builds your success. And you want to see what's available in the fantasy market before committing to reality. Her words hit him like physical blows because they forced him to confront the selfish core of his request. He wasn't asking for understanding or support, he was asking for permission to humiliate her while keeping her available as his backup plan. I love you, he said desperately. Everything I'm feeling, everything I'm asking, it comes from loving you too much to lie to you. If you loved me too much to lie, Tara said with devastating clarity, you'd love me too much to want anyone else in the first place. The truth of that statement settled between them like a death sentence for the conversation. Marvin opened his mouth to argue, to explain, to somehow convince her that his desire for another woman was compatible with his love for her, but no words came. If you walk out that door to be with her, Tara said with quiet dignity, moving to their dresser and beginning to remove her jewelry, don't come back. I mean that, Marvin. Whatever we were, whatever we built together, it ends the moment you choose her over me. And if I don't go? If I stay and try to work through this? She paused in removing her wedding ring, considering the question seriously. Then you'll spend the rest of our marriage wondering what you missed, resenting me for being the woman who kept you from your dreams. Either way, the marriage we had, the one built on mutual respect and complete trust, that's already over. The finality in her voice terrified him more than any threat ever could. Tara, please, there has to be another way through this. There is, she said, setting her wedding ring on the dresser with a soft clink that sounded like breaking glass. You can choose. Right now, in this moment, you can decide what matters more, satisfying your curiosity or protecting our love. Why should I have to choose? Why can't we be mature adults who work through complicated feelings together? Because some feelings are incompatible with marriage, she said, removing the anniversary necklace and placing it beside her ring. The feeling that your spouse isn't enough for you? That's not something you work through together. That's something that kills love slowly, day by day, until you wake up strangers who used to share dreams. She walked to their closet and pulled out a small suitcase, her movements efficient and final. I'm going to Maya's house tonight. When I come back tomorrow evening, I want to know what you've decided. Decided about what? About who you are, she said, beginning to pack with the precision of someone who'd made peace with the end of everything she'd believed in. The man who honors his commitments even when they feel limiting, or the man who abandons them when something more exciting comes along. As she folded clothes into the suitcase, Marvin felt panic clawing at his chest. This is really it? You're really leaving? I'm giving you space to make your choice without my presence influencing the outcome, she said without looking at him. When you figure out what you actually want instead of what you think you should want, you'll know what to do. She finished packing and walked to the bedroom door, pausing to look back at him one final time. I love you, Marvin. I have loved you with everything I am for 7 years, but I love myself too much to compete for my own husband's attention. You're not competing, aren't I? Her smile was sad and knowing. You just told me you need to sleep with another woman to decide if I'm worth choosing. That's the definition of competition, and it's a game I refuse to play." The front door closed behind her with a soft click that echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. Marvin stood alone in their bedroom, surrounded by the remnants of their perfect love, finally understanding that some choices reveal exactly who you are, and sometimes that revelation destroys everything you thought you wanted to protect. Outside, the city hummed with life and possibility, but inside their sanctuary, silence settled like snow over the grave of a marriage that had died not from lack of love, but from one person's inability to recognize that the greatest adventure was learning to cherish what you'd already found. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. Some bridges burn so quietly you don't hear the flames until they've consumed everything you thought was permanent, leaving you standing on opposite sides of a chasm that can never be crossed again. Marvin sat in his empty penthouse for exactly 37 minutes after Tara walked out, staring at the wedding ring and anniversary necklace she'd left on their dresser like evidence of a crime he wasn't sure he'd committed yet. The silence was deafening. No jazz music, no vanilla candles, no soft humming from the woman who'd made their house feel alive. His phone lay on the nightstand, Elisha's card propped against it like a small white flag of surrender. For 37 minutes, he wrestled with the choice that would define the rest of his life. Honor the commitment he'd made to the woman who'd loved him unconditionally, or chase the fantasy that promised to remind him who he used to be. The rational part of his mind screamed that he should call Tara, apologize, beg her to come home so they could work through this like adults. But the part that had been slowly suffocating under the weight of routine whispered that maybe this was exactly the permission he needed to remember what it felt like to be truly alive. At 1:23 a.m., his hands shaking with something between anticipation and terror, he dialed Elisha's number. "I was wondering when you'd call," her honeyed voice answered on the second ring, as if she'd been waiting by the phone. "How did your wife handle the truth?" "She left," Marvin said, the words tasting like ashes. "Of course she did," Elisha said with satisfaction that made his chest tighten uncomfortably. "Women like that always run when faced with real competition. She'll be back, Marvin. They always come back once they realize there's nowhere else to go." The casual dismissal of Tara's strength and independence should have angered him, but instead it fed the narrative he needed to believe, that his wife's reaction was dramatic rather than justified, emotional rather than rational. "She said if I came to you I shouldn't come back." "Empty threats," Elisha said with certainty, born from years of studying human nature from the outside. "Trust me, I understand women like her. Devoted, dependable, desperate to maintain their perfect lives. She's testing you to see if you'll choose security over passion." "Where are you?" "The plaza." "But Marvin?" Her voice dropped to a whisper that sent heat racing through his veins. "Are you absolutely certain you're ready for this?" "Once you cross this line, everything changes." "Everything already changed," he said, and realized it was true. The moment he'd confessed his desire for another woman, he'd stepped across a boundary that couldn't be uncrossed. 45 minutes later, Marvin stood outside Elisha's hotel suite, his heart hammering against his ribs. Part of him still expected to turn around, go home, find some way to rebuild the trust he'd shattered with his honesty. But when the door opened to reveal Elisha in silk that left nothing to imagination, rational thought abandoned him entirely. "You came," she said, pulling him into a space that smelled like expensive perfume and possibility. "I'm here," he confirmed, though part of him felt like he was watching someone else's life unfold. What followed was everything he'd fantasized about, and nothing like what he'd expected. Elisha was passionate, but her responses felt practiced, as if she'd perfected the art of making men feel desired without actually desiring them herself. Even as Marvin lost himself in sensations he'd forgotten he could feel, part of him kept thinking about dark eyes, filled with betrayal, and a voice saying, "I love myself too much to be your second choice." The guilt didn't come later. It arrived in the middle of passion itself, making him feel like he was betraying not just his wife, but some essential part of himself. Meanwhile, across the city in Maya's modest Brooklyn apartment, Tara sat on her sister's couch, staring at her phone and processing the complete destruction of everything she'd believed about her marriage. At 30, she'd never imagined she'd be seeking refuge from her own husband's betrayal, but here she was, wearing borrowed pajamas and trying to understand how 5 years of love could evaporate in a single conversation. "He's not worth your tears," Maya said, setting tea beside her sister while radiating the protective fury of someone who'd watched Tara sacrifice piece after piece of herself for a man who'd apparently been keeping score. "I keep thinking he'll call," Tara whispered, "that he'll realize what he's throwing away and choose us instead. And if he does, if he comes home with apologies and promises, then I'll know he only chose me because his fantasy disappointed him," Tara said, the words breaking her heart all over again. "Not because he realized I was worth fighting for in the first place." At 3:17 a.m., her phone finally rang. For a moment, hope flared in her chest. Maybe he'd come to his senses. Maybe their love was stronger than his curiosity about roads not taken. But when she answered, expecting apologies or explanations, she instead heard the unmistakable sounds of passion, breathless whispers, soft moans, and Marvin's voice saying, "Just a minute," before the line went dead. He'd called her by accident while with another woman, his phone dialing her number from his pocket during the very betrayal that had ended their marriage. The humiliation was almost worse than the heartbreak. "Oh, sweetheart," Maya whispered, seeing Tara's face crumple with the brutal finality of absolute betrayal. But instead of dissolving into tears, something steel-hard crystallized in Tara's chest. She'd spent hours wondering if she'd overreacted, if she should have been more understanding of his crisis, if good wives were supposed to forgive curiosity and work through complicated feelings together. That accidental phone call had shown her the truth. While she'd been questioning her own judgment, he'd been exploring every fantasy with the woman he'd chosen over their marriage. "I need to go back to the penthouse," she said, standing with sudden purpose that surprised them both. "It's 3 in the morning. I need to pack everything before he comes home, expecting to find his devoted wife waiting to discuss our future like reasonable adults." Maya grabbed her keys without argument, understanding that some decisions couldn't wait for morning light or rational conversation. The penthouse felt like a mausoleum when they entered, filled with the ghosts of 5 years of shared dreams and 7 years of love that had apparently meant more to her than to him. Tara moved through their home with mechanical efficiency, packing her life into boxes while Maya watched with growing admiration for her sister's strength. "Take everything that's yours," Maya said fiercely. "Don't leave a single thing behind for him to use as an excuse to contact you later." Tara took her clothes, her books, her grandmother's jewelry, the marketing awards she'd earned, everything that represented her individual identity rather than their shared life. She left behind the expensive gifts, the designer handbags, the luxury items that had been his way of expressing affection when words felt inadequate. In their bedroom, she found the love letter she'd written but never given him, planned as a surprise to slip into his briefcase. The words mocked her now. "Every day, I wake up grateful that the universe conspired to make you mine. You are my greatest adventure, my safest harbor, my forever love." She burned it in their fireplace, watching her naive words turn to ash. By dawn, Tara had moved her entire life to Maya's apartment and signed the lease on a small but elegant space in Soho. It wasn't much compared to the penthouse, but it was hers. Every decision about paint colors, furniture placement, and how to spend her evenings would be made by her alone, for her own happiness rather than someone else's comfort. When Marvin returned home at 8:30 a.m., guilt and satisfaction warring in his chest, he found only empty closets and the deafening silence of a woman who'd finally stopped waiting to be chosen. On the kitchen counter, face down, lay their wedding photo with a note in Tara's elegant script. "I hope she was worth the cost of learning the difference between fantasy and reality. Don't contact me again." Standing in the ruins of the life he'd built, with the only woman who'd ever loved him unconditionally, Marvin Duran finally understood that some prices are only revealed after you've already paid them, and some lessons cost everything you can't afford to lose. Chapter 5. Tara's Awakening. The phoenix doesn't rise from the ashes because it's easy. It rises because burning away everything that was never truly yours reveals the fire that was always meant to be your wings. 3 months after walking out of her marriage, Tara Davis sat across from Richard Morrison in the sterile conference room of Morrison Industries, watching his expression change from polite interest to barely concealed condescension as she concluded her presentation. "Miss Davis," he said, leaning back in his leather chair with the casual arrogance of a man who'd inherited his position, "this is certainly creative. But I have to wonder if someone with your limited independent experience truly understands the complexities of heritage brands like ours." Tara felt her jaw tighten, but kept her voice professionally smooth. "Mr. Morrison, I spent 3 years developing marketing strategies that increased Durantech's market share by 40%. My track record speaks for itself." "Working for your husband's company," Morrison said dismissively, "that's quite different from building your own client base, don't you think? We need an agency with proven independence, not someone playing at entrepreneurship." The words hit like physical blows. Every fear she'd harbored about leaving Marvin's protection, every doubt about her ability to succeed on her own merit, crystallized in Morrison's smug smile. "I see," she said, gathering her materials with hands that wanted to shake but refused to give him the satisfaction. "Thank you for your time." 20 minutes later, she sat in Maya's kitchen with rejection email number 3 open on her laptop screen, each one a variation of the same theme. "Creative ideas, but we've decided to go with a more established firm." "Another rejection?" Maya asked, appearing in the doorway with messy hair and the rumpled scrubs that meant she'd worked another 18-hour shift as a public defender. At 28, Maya had built her career fighting for people the system overlooked, and she brought that same fierce energy to protecting her sister. "Morrison Industries," Tara said, closing her laptop with barely controlled frustration. "They loved my pitch, complimented my vision, then hired the agency that charged 3 times my rate because they've been in business longer." "Their loss," Maya said loyally, though they both knew that noble sentiment didn't pay the bills that were piling up on Tara's makeshift desk. The truth was that leaving Marvin had been more complicated than simply walking away from a cheating husband. She'd walked away from financial security, professional connections, and the comfortable assumption that money would never be a concern. Her savings account, healthy by most standards, was hemorrhaging as she tried to launch a business while paying for legal representation that could match Marvin's inevitable army of attorneys. "I've been thinking," Tara said, pouring coffee into 2 mismatched mugs that somehow felt more honest than the matching fine china she'd left behind. "Maybe this was a mistake. Maybe I should have stayed, worked through his crisis, found a way to save our marriage instead of running at the first sign of trouble." Maya set down her coffee with enough force to slosh liquid onto the counter. Tara Marie Davis, you did not run from trouble. You walked away from a man who asked permission to betray you. There's a difference. But maybe I could have fought for us. Maybe I gave up too easily because my pride was hurt, instead of trying to understand what he was really going through. What he was going through, Maya said, with the precision of someone who'd spent years cross-examining criminals, was a selfish desire to have his cake and eat it too. Don't rewrite history to make his betrayal your fault. But doubt had been eating at Tara for weeks. The business failures, the mounting expenses, the exhausting process of rebuilding her entire identity from scratch, all of it made her question whether she'd been too hasty, too unforgiving, too unwilling to fight for something that had taken 7 years to build. Her laptop chimed with another email, and Tara's heart sank as she read the subject line. R.E. Legal consultation. Payment required. Patricia Williams, the attorney who'd seemed so confident about Tara's prospects, was now requesting additional payment for services that were taking longer than expected. Marvin's legal team was employing delay tactics that required more billable hours to counter, and Tara's legal fund was running dangerously low. How bad is it? Maya asked, reading her sister's expression with the accuracy that came from 28 years of sisterhood. Bad enough that I might have to represent myself if this drags on much longer, Tara admitted. Marvin's lawyers are stalling on the financial discovery, claiming his business valuations are more complex than anticipated. Meanwhile, I'm bleeding money I don't have while trying to start a company with clients who don't trust me yet. Can you ask Mom and Dad for help? They've already offered, Tara said quietly. But taking money from parents who sacrificed everything to put me through college feels like admitting I failed at being an adult. Maya was quiet for a moment, then made a decision that would change both their lives. Move in with me officially. Split the rent, utilities, groceries. Use the money you save to keep your lawyer and your business afloat. Maya, I can't ask you to. You're not asking. I'm offering. Besides, Maya grinned, though her eyes were serious, I've missed having you around. It's been lonely being the only Davis sister who refuses to let men determine her life choices. The arrangement should have felt like failure, a 30-year-old woman moving back in with family because she couldn't support herself independently. Instead, it felt like the first step toward building something real rather than impressive. That afternoon, Tara did something she'd been avoiding for 3 months. She called her former colleague, Jessica Park, who'd left Durantech 8 months ago to start her own digital design firm. Tara! Oh my God, I heard about you and Marvin. I'm so sorry. Don't be sorry, Tara interrupted, her voice stronger than it had been in weeks. Be interested. I'm starting my own marketing consultancy, and I could use a creative partner who understands taking risks. Are you serious? You're really doing it? I'm broke, desperate, and completely terrified, Tara said honestly. But I'm also more determined than I've ever been in my life. I have some freelance projects lined up, enough to keep us fed while we build something meaningful. What kind of projects? Small businesses mostly. A family-owned restaurant in Queens, a boutique fitness studio, a non-profit that helps women transition out of abusive relationships. She paused, hearing how her voice changed when she talked about work that mattered rather than just work that paid. Not glamorous clients, but their stories are real. Their challenges are authentic, and they trust me to help them grow instead of just maintain what they already have. Jessica's excitement was infectious. When do we start? The next week brought a breakthrough that felt like vindication and terror in equal measure. The women's shelter nonprofit, impressed with her preliminary concepts, referred her to 3 other organizations serving vulnerable populations. None of them could pay much, but their missions resonated with something deep in Tara's chest, the part of her that had always wanted to use her talents for more than just generating profit. "You're glowing," Maya observed one evening, finding Tara working at their kitchen table surrounded by campaign materials for a domestic violence prevention program. "I'm working on something that matters," Tara said, looking up from her sketches with bright eyes. "Not just selling products people don't need, but actually helping organizations change lives." "Is it enough? Financially, I mean." "Not yet," Tara admitted, "but it's a foundation. And I'd rather build slowly on something meaningful than quickly on something hollow." The breakthrough came when Regina Foster, director of the women's shelter, called with news that would change everything. "Tara, I just got off the phone with the Pemberton Foundation. They fund non-profits across the Northeast, and they want to meet with you about creating a comprehensive awareness campaign. The budget is substantial, enough to pay a real agency, not just freelance rates. They want to meet with me specifically. They saw your preliminary work for our shelter and were impressed with your approach. Apparently, most agencies treat non-profit work like charity cases, giving them watered-down versions of corporate campaigns. You treated us like we deserved the same creativity and sophistication as any Fortune 500 company." The Pemberton Foundation meeting was scheduled for the following week, and Tara spent days preparing with an intensity that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with marketing in the first place. This wasn't about manipulating consumers into buying things they didn't need. This was about telling stories that could literally save lives. But on the morning of the presentation, her confidence wavered. Standing outside the Foundation's headquarters in Midtown, wearing her best suit and carrying a portfolio of work that represented her heart and soul, she felt the weight of everything riding on the next 2 hours. If she failed, she'd have to consider going back to corporate marketing, taking a safe job with a steady paycheck while her dreams of independence slowly died. If she succeeded, she'd have the financial breathing room to build the company she'd always envisioned. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Heard about your Pemberton presentation today. Always knew you were capable of incredible things when you weren't limiting yourself to someone else's vision. Good luck. M. Marvin." Somehow he'd learned about her meeting, and despite everything that had happened between them, he was wishing her success. The message should have angered her, but instead it reminded her of something she'd almost forgotten in the chaos of betrayal and rebuilding. She was genuinely talented at what she did. Not because he'd taught her or supported her or provided opportunities, but because she'd been born with gifts that had nothing to do with him. "Miss Davis?" A voice interrupted her thoughts. "I'm Robert Pemberton. Thank you for meeting with us today." The presentation went better than Tara had dared hope. For 90 minutes, she demonstrated not just marketing strategies, but genuine understanding of the challenges facing vulnerable populations. She'd done research that surprised board members who'd been working in non-profit funding for decades, proposed solutions that showed both creativity and practical awareness of budget limitations. "This is exactly what we've been looking for," Robert Pemberton said as she finished. "Someone who understands that our organizations deserve the same level of sophistication as corporate clients, but adapted for missions that matter more than profit margins." The contract they offered was worth more than she'd made in her last year at Durantech. More importantly, it represented validation that her instincts about meaningful work had been correct. There was a market for marketing that served purposes beyond consumption. Walking out of their offices with a signed contract in her briefcase, Tara felt something she hadn't experienced since she was 23 and full of dreams that seemed limitless. The intoxicating certainty that she was exactly where she belonged, doing exactly what she was meant to do. For the first time in months, she wasn't thinking about what she'd lost. She was thinking about everything she was going to build. 3 months after her world had ended, Tara Davis was beginning to understand that some endings are actually beginnings in disguise, and that the woman she was becoming was worth more than the woman she'd agreed to be for someone who'd confused her devotion with limitation. Chapter 6. Marvin's Reality Check. The cruelest awakening isn't discovering that your fantasy was a lie. It's realizing that your fantasy was someone else's survival strategy, and you were too selfish to see their pain behind their performance. 3 months after destroying his marriage for a taste of danger, Marvin Duran woke up in Elisha's bed, feeling like a stranger in his own skin. At 32, he'd expected this relationship to restore his sense of youth and possibility. Instead, lying beside a woman who was beautiful beyond imagination but somehow felt like a mirage, he was beginning to understand the difference between excitement and emptiness. "You're thinking too loudly," Elisha murmured, without opening her eyes, her voice carrying the practiced sensuality that had initially intoxicated him, but now felt as automatic as breathing. "It's going to give you wrinkles. And then where will we be?" She was joking, but there was an edge beneath the humor that Marvin had learned to recognize over the past 3 months. Everything with Elisha carried subtext. Every conversation was a performance. Every moment felt calculated rather than spontaneous. "Just work stress," he lied, watching her stretch like a contented cat in the morning light, filtering through the silk curtains of the penthouse apartment he'd rented for her. Even in sleep, she was careful to position herself attractively, as if relaxation was a luxury she couldn't afford. "Work again," she sighed, finally opening blue eyes that were stunning, but somehow never seemed to truly see him. "Marvin, darling, the whole point of being rich is that you don't have to work constantly. You hire people to handle the boring details so you can focus on living." "I enjoy my work," he said, reaching for his shirt. "You enjoy control," she corrected with the sharp insight that occasionally reminded him there was a formidable intelligence behind her beauty. "You enjoy being needed, being important, being the brilliant man everyone looks up to. But when was the last time you actually had fun?" It was a fair question, but not in the way she meant it. Marvin had been having less fun with each passing week, despite living exactly the kind of adventurous life he'd thought he wanted. Late nights at exclusive clubs, spontaneous trips to places he'd only read about, passion that burned hot and fast and left him feeling curiously hollow afterward. "I have fun with you," he said, though it felt more like a question than a statement. "You have excitement with me," Elisha corrected, sitting up and wrapping the sheet around herself with unconscious modesty that seemed at odds with her usual brazen confidence. "But fun. Real joy. I'm not sure either of us remembers what that feels like." The observation was more perceptive than he'd expected, and it forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding. Despite the adventure, the passion, the constant stimulation of new experiences, he couldn't remember the last time he'd genuinely laughed. Not performed enjoyment for social media or business networking, but actually felt joy bubbling up from somewhere deep and authentic. "I should get to the office," he said, uncomfortable with the direction of his thoughts. "Should," Elisha repeated, tasting the word with something that looked like sadness. "You know, in foster care, should was the word adults used when they were about to make you do something that served their needs instead of yours. You should be grateful, you should adapt, you should understand." She'd mentioned foster care only once before, during their first night together, and Marvin had been too intoxicated with finally having her to ask follow-up questions. Now, seeing something vulnerable flicker across her perfect features, he realized he'd never bothered to truly know the woman he'd destroyed his marriage to possess. "You never talk about your childhood," he said, sitting back down on the edge of the bed. Because it's not relevant to what we have, she said quickly, but her defensive posture suggested otherwise. The past is the past. I don't believe in dwelling on things you can't change. But it shaped who you became. It taught me to survive, she said with a shrug that was meant to look casual, but carried the weight of years of practiced indifference. When you're passed between strangers who see you as either a burden or an opportunity, you learn to make yourself valuable quickly. You learn what people want from you and how to give just enough to stay safe while protecting the parts they can't touch. The confession hit Marvin like a revelation. For 3 months, he'd been frustrated by Elisha's apparent superficiality, her focus on appearances and material things, her seeming inability to connect on deeper levels. But now, he was beginning to understand that her behavior wasn't born from vanity. It was a survival strategy developed by a child who'd learned that love was conditional and safety was temporary. "Is that what you're doing with me?" he asked quietly. "Giving me just enough to stay safe?" Elisha's laugh was beautiful, but hollow. "Marvin, you left your wife for me. You destroyed a 5-year marriage because I reminded you of excitement and danger. What do you think would happen if you discovered I'm just another damaged woman looking for security?" "I'd want to help you feel secure," he said honestly. "No, you wouldn't," she said with certainty born from experience. "You'd be disappointed that your fantasy woman turned out to be human. You'd start missing the wife who made you feel stable instead of the mistress who makes you feel dangerous." Her insight was so accurate it made his chest ache. Had he been using her the same way she'd been using him, as an escape from reality rather than a genuine connection? Had their entire relationship been built on mutual exploitation disguised as passion? "You're more complex than I gave you credit for," he admitted. "Everyone is," Elisha said, and for a moment her carefully constructed mask slipped enough for him to see the lonely girl underneath. "But complexity doesn't photograph well, doesn't fit the fantasy, doesn't sell the dream that people want to buy into." "What dream?" "The one where the successful man leaves his practical wife for the exciting mistress, and they live passionately ever after." She stood up, wrapping herself in a silk robe that probably cost more than most people's cars. "Except that only works in movies, because real passion requires real connection, and real connection requires seeing people as they actually are, instead of as what you need them to represent." Marvin felt something cold settling in his stomach. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying we've both been playing roles, darling. You've been playing the dangerous man who takes what he wants, and I've been playing the irresistible woman worth destroying a marriage for. But neither of us is actually those people." "Then who are we?" Elisha walked to the window, looking out at the city where both of them felt like outsiders, despite their apparent success. "You're a man who confused being grateful for love with being entitled to excitement, and I'm a woman who learned to survive by giving people fantasies instead of truth." "That doesn't have to be all we are," Marvin said, though even as he spoke the words, he wasn't sure he believed them. "Doesn't it?" She turned back to face him, and he was struck by how young she looked without her armor of perfect makeup and calculated seduction. "Tell me, when you're with me, are you thinking about building a future together? Or are you thinking about how alive you feel compared to how dead you felt in your marriage?" The question forced him to confront something he'd been avoiding. He'd never once imagined a real future with Elisha. No conversations about shared dreams, no plans beyond the next adventure, no vision of growing old together. She'd been a drug rather than a partner, something to make him feel better about himself without actually addressing why he'd needed to feel different in the first place. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I do," Elisha said with sad certainty. You're using me to feel like the man you used to be, and I'm using you to feel like the woman I always wanted to become. But neither of us is actually becoming anything. We're just performing." The truth of it settled between them like a death sentence for whatever they'd been calling their relationship. For 3 months, Marvin had been telling himself that this was what passion felt like, what real desire looked like. But passion without purpose was just elaborate emptiness, and desire without genuine affection was just sophisticated loneliness. His phone buzzed with a notification about a business meeting, and he realized with sudden clarity that work had become his escape from this relationship the same way this relationship had been his escape from his marriage. He was running from every situation that required him to be authentically present. "I should go," he said, reaching for his clothes. "There's that word again," Alicia observed. "Should." The word people use when they're about to choose duty over truth. As he dressed, Marvin caught sight of himself in her bedroom mirror. The man looking back at him appeared successful and confident, but his eyes held the hollow exhaustion of someone who'd been performing happiness for so long, he'd forgotten what genuine contentment felt like. "Elisha," he said suddenly, "do you ever miss being real instead of perfect?" "Every single day," she admitted quietly. "But I learned a long time ago that real doesn't pay the bills or open doors or protect you from people who see vulnerability as opportunity. What if you didn't have to perform anymore? What if someone wanted to see who you really are underneath all the survival strategies?" Her smile was infinitely sad. "Then I'd probably run, because I've been playing this role so long, I'm not sure there's anyone left underneath it. Just like you're not sure who you are when you're not trying to be someone else's version of impressive." The conversation followed him all day, haunting his business meetings and strategic planning sessions. He'd thought his crisis was about wanting excitement over stability, passion over routine. But Alicia had shown him something more disturbing. He'd become so focused on being what others expected that he'd lost track of who he actually was beneath all the performance. That evening, driving through Manhattan streets that had once felt like his kingdom but now felt like an elaborate stage set, Marvin Duran began to understand that he hadn't left his wife for another woman. He'd left himself for another fantasy, and now he was left with neither the life he'd abandoned nor the dream he'd chased. Chapter 7. The Transformation. True success isn't measured by how high you climb, but by how much of yourself you remember to bring with you on the journey up. 1 year after walking out of her marriage, Tara Davis stood in the conference room of Davis Creative Solutions, watching her team of 7 employees prepare for their biggest presentation yet. At 31, she'd learned that building an empire was less about dramatic victories and more about surviving 1,000 small defeats while refusing to compromise on the vision that made the struggle worthwhile. The past year had been a masterclass in resilience. The Pemberton Foundation contract had provided the financial foundation, but everything after that had been earned through 18-hour days, rejected pitches, clients who questioned her experience, and the constant challenge of proving that a young black woman could deliver results that matched her ambition. Her legal battle with Marvin was still ongoing, but Patricia Williams remained confident about the eventual settlement. Morrison Industries just confirmed, Jessica Park announced, entering with the nervous energy that had become their trademark before major presentations. "Full board attendance. They're either going to hire us or destroy us publicly." "No pressure," Tara said with a smile that had learned to mask anxiety without hiding determination. The irony wasn't lost on her. Morrison Industries was the same company that had rejected her 3 months after leaving Marvin, dismissing her as too inexperienced despite loving her concepts. Now, after a year of building credibility with smaller clients, they'd reached out requesting a second chance to hear her ideas. "You've got this," said Marcus Thompson, her newest hire and former Durantech colleague, who'd watched her transformation with something approaching awe. Remember what happened with the Pemberton presentation? You walked in there terrified and walked out with a contract that changed everything. That was different, Tara said, reviewing her notes one final time. Non-profit work is about heart and mission. Corporate work is about ego and profit margins. These people want innovation, but only if it doesn't threaten their comfort zone. Then make them comfortable with being uncomfortable, suggested Lisa Chen, their data analyst, who'd joined the team specifically because she was tired of working for agencies that treated numbers like gospel instead of starting points for creative thinking. The presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m., which gave Tara 3 hours to manage the anxiety that had become her constant companion. Success hadn't cured her imposter syndrome, it had just raised the stakes for each new challenge. Her phone buzzed with a text from James Mitchell. "Know you're nervous about today. Remember that they called you, which means they already believe you're capable of solving their problems. Just show them what I see every time you talk about your work. Pure genius wrapped in killer presentation skills." The message made her smile for the first time all morning. She'd met James 6 months ago at a gallery opening Maya had dragged her to, and what had started as polite conversation over mediocre wine had evolved into something that challenged everything she thought she understood about relationships. James, 34 years old and divorced for 2 years, designed affordable housing and community centers instead of chasing the most lucrative architectural commissions. He was brilliant, passionate about his work, and carried his own emotional baggage with the kind of self-awareness that came from hard-won experience. "How's the pre-presentation panic?" Maya asked, appearing in Tara's office doorway with coffee and the knowing expression of someone who'd watched her sister's entire transformation. "Manageable," Tara lied. "I just keep thinking about what happens if I fail. All these people who believed in me, who left stable jobs to build something meaningful. What happens to them if I can't deliver?" "You mean what happens if you're human instead of superhuman?" Maya settled into the chair across from Tara's desk, her own exhaustion evident after another brutal week defending clients the system had written off. "Tara, you've built something incredible in 12 months. Even if Morrison says no, you'll survive and find other clients." "Will I, though?" The question came from a deeper place than professional anxiety. "Sometimes I wonder if I'm building something real, or just proving to myself that I can survive without Marvin. What if this whole business is just elaborate revenge disguised as independence?" "What if it is?" Maya asked pragmatically. "Even if it started as revenge, look what you've created. 7 employees who respect your leadership, clients whose businesses have grown because of your strategies, work that actually makes a difference in people's lives." It was true. Over the past year, Tara had helped a family restaurant increase revenue by 40%, launched a campaign that doubled enrollment at a community college, and created brand strategies for 3 non-profits that had resulted in significant increases in both funding and volunteer participation. "I just miss having someone to share it with," Tara admitted. "Someone who understands the work itself, not just the success." "What about James?" "James is—" Tara paused, trying to find words for something complicated. "He's wonderful. He's supportive and kind and genuinely interested in my work. But sometimes I feel like we're both trying so hard not to repeat our past mistakes that we're afraid to actually build something real together." "What kind of past mistakes?" "His marriage ended because his ex-wife felt like he cared more about his social justice projects than their relationship. Sound familiar? And I'm so paranoid about losing my independence again that I analyze every interaction for signs that he might want to change me or limit me or make me smaller to fit his needs." "So you're both emotionally unavailable," Maya summarized with the brutal efficiency that made her an excellent attorney. "We're both careful," Tara corrected. "Maybe too careful." It's hard to build intimacy when you're constantly protecting yourself from being hurt again. The Morrison presentation went better than Tara had dared hope. For 90 minutes, she demonstrated not just marketing strategies, but genuine understanding of their industry challenges. She'd learned from her previous rejection, researching not just their company but their competitors, their market position, their customers' evolving needs. "This isn't just rebranding," Robert Morrison said when she finished, his previous skepticism replaced by something approaching excitement. "This is revolution disguised as evolution." "Exactly," Tara replied. "You don't need to abandon your heritage. You need to make your heritage relevant to people who care about different things than your traditional customers." The contract they offered was substantial enough to secure her company's future for the next 2 years. More importantly, it represented validation that her instincts about meaningful work had been correct. There was a market for marketing that honored both profit and purpose. After the Morrison team left, her staff erupted in celebration that felt genuine rather than performed. These people had believed in her vision when she was still figuring it out herself, and their success felt shared rather than individual. "Dinner to celebrate," Jessica suggested. "The whole team plus significant others." "Actually," Tara said, surprising herself, "I think I'd like to cook dinner for James tonight. Something quiet and personal instead of public celebration." She'd been avoiding intimate gestures, afraid they implied dependence or expectation. But tonight, she wanted to share her success with someone who cared about her achievements, not because they reflected well on him, but because he genuinely wanted her to thrive. That evening, James arrived at her Soho apartment with wildflowers instead of expensive roses, a choice that somehow meant more because it suggested he'd been thinking about what she would actually enjoy rather than what was expected. "Tell me about Morrison Industries," he said, settling onto her couch with the easy comfort of someone who'd learned to navigate her spaces without trying to claim them. Not just whether you got the contract, but how it felt to present to them after they rejected you before. "You remember that they rejected me?" she asked, surprised by the specific attention to details from their conversations weeks ago. "I remember everything you tell me about your work," James said simply. "How it felt matters as much as how it ended." For the next hour, they dissected not just her business success, but her emotional journey through it. The fear, the preparation, the moment when she'd seen respect dawn in Morrison's eyes. James listened with the kind of focused attention that made her feel heard rather than just supported. "I have news too," he said when she finished. "The community center project got final approval." "James, that's incredible." Her excitement for his achievement was immediate and unqualified, free from the careful calculations that had sometimes marked her celebrations of Marvin's success. "When do you break ground?" "Next month. 18 months from vision to reality." His smile was quiet but deeply satisfied. "Sometimes meaningful work takes longer than profitable work. But it's worth the wait." "Everything worth having is worth waiting for," he said, and she understood he wasn't just talking about architecture. "Always." "Do you ever worry that we're building a relationship based on what we don't want instead of what we do want?" She curled up beside him, close enough to feel his warmth, but maintaining enough space to think clearly. "Like we're both so determined not to repeat our past mistakes that we're afraid to risk making new ones." James was quiet for a long moment, his brown eyes thoughtful in the lamplight. "Every single day," he admitted. "My marriage ended because I was so passionate about my work that I forgot to be passionate about my wife. Now I'm with someone whose passion for her work is one of the things I love most about her, but I'm terrified of asking for more emotional intimacy because I don't want to seem like I'm demanding you prioritize me over your dreams." And I'm terrified of wanting more because I spent 5 years gradually losing myself in someone else's vision of love, Tara said. So we're both holding back. Maybe, James said, reaching for her hand with the careful tenderness of someone who'd learned that hearts break more easily than they heal. Or maybe we're building something sustainable instead of something that burns bright and fast. Is that what you want? Sustainable. I want real, he said simply. I want to know the person underneath all the protective strategies and survival mechanisms. I want to build something that can handle complexity instead of something that only works when everything is perfect. The honesty in his voice made something shift in Tara's chest. That sounds terrifying. It is terrifying, James agreed. But it's also the only way to find out if what we have is worth protecting or if we're just two damaged people helping each other avoid dealing with our issues. They spent the evening talking with a depth they'd been avoiding for months about his failed marriage, her trust issues, their shared fear of vulnerability, and their growing certainty that whatever was building between them was worth the risk of being hurt again. As the city settled into night around them, two people who'd learned that love could be dangerous began the tentative process of discovering whether it could also be safe, whether passion and security could coexist, and whether the best relationships were built not by avoiding damage, but by trusting someone enough to let them see your scars. Chapter 8. The Reckoning. True power isn't about crushing those who underestimated you. It's about becoming so authentically magnificent that their belated recognition feels irrelevant to the life you've built without them. 18 months after walking out of her marriage, Tara Davis was reviewing expansion plans when her assistant knocked on her office door with an expression that mixed professional concern with personal protectiveness. Kim Rodriguez had developed an almost maternal instinct about protecting her boss from anything that might disrupt the focused energy that had built their company from desperate dream to industry disruption. "Miss Davis, there's a Marvin Duran insisting he has an appointment," Kim said, her tone suggesting she knew exactly who this man was and why his presence might be problematic. "I've checked your calendar twice, and there's nothing scheduled." Tara's hands stilled on the financial projections that showed Davis Creative Solutions had not only survived its rocky first year, but was now generating revenue that exceeded her most optimistic forecasts. 18 months had passed since she'd heard Marvin's voice, since she'd blocked his final desperate attempts to contact her. She'd assumed he'd finally accepted that their marriage was irretrievably over. "What did you tell him?" she asked, proud that her voice remained steady despite the adrenaline suddenly flooding her system. "That you're in meetings all day, and he could schedule through proper channels like everyone else. He said he'd wait." Kim's disapproval was evident. "Should I have security escort him out? You don't owe him access to your time." The protective loyalty in Kim's voice reminded Tara how much her life had changed. She'd surrounded herself with people who respected her authority, supported her vision, and would defend her interests without being asked. The woman who'd once molded herself around her husband's needs had built a team that adapted to her leadership style instead. "Send him in," she decided, "but give me 5 minutes to prepare." Alone in her office, Tara surveyed the space she'd created as a monument to authentic success. The walls displayed awards for campaigns that had changed how entire industries talked to their customers, photographs of non-profit events where her strategies had raised millions for vulnerable populations, and artistic pieces from local creators she'd commissioned specifically to support emerging talent. This wasn't just an office, it was proof that you could build something meaningful without sacrificing your values or your identity in the process. When Marvin entered, Tara's breath caught despite 18 months of emotional preparation. At 33, he still possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention, but something fundamental had shifted in him. The arrogant confidence that had once been magnetic had been replaced by something humbler, more uncertain. He looked like a man who'd learned expensive lessons about the difference between having everything and appreciating anything. "Hello, Marvin," she said, her voice professionally cordial as she remained standing behind her desk, a position that maintained both literal and metaphorical distance. "Tara." He stopped just inside her office, clearly overwhelmed by what he was seeing. "This place is incredible. You really did it. You built exactly what you always dreamed about." "I built what I needed to survive," she corrected, studying his face for signs of the man she'd once loved unconditionally. "Dreams were a luxury I couldn't afford after my life imploded." "I know I'm the reason your life imploded," he said quietly, the words coming out hesitant and broken. "I know I have no right to be here, but I had to." He stopped, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Christ, I used to be good with words." "Take your time," she said, not unkindly. "I needed to see you. To try to explain, even though I know explanations don't fix anything." He looked up at her, and she could see him wrestling with admissions that clearly cost him. "The truth is, what I did to us, it wasn't really about her. It was about me feeling like I wasn't what? Wasn't good enough for you," he said finally, the words rushing out like he was afraid he'd lose courage if he didn't say them immediately. "There. I said it. I felt inadequate next to your brilliance, so I went looking for someone who would make me feel superior instead of challenged." "Painful how?" Tara asked, genuinely curious about his psychology rather than moved by his compliments. "Because it forced me to confront the truth about our marriage," he said, his voice growing stronger with honesty. "I didn't leave you because you weren't enough. I left because you were too much, too brilliant, too accomplished, too everything, and I felt inadequate in comparison. So I went looking for someone who would make me feel superior instead of challenged." The confession was more insightful than anything he'd offered during their marriage, but it came 18 months too late to matter. "And did you feel superior?" "For about a week," he said with bitter self-awareness, "until I realized that feeling superior to someone you don't respect is just elaborate loneliness. Elisha was beautiful and exciting and everything I thought I wanted, but she never challenged me to be better. She just reflected whatever version of myself I wanted to perform that day." "What happened between you?" "Reality," Marvin said simply. "We were both using each other to avoid dealing with our actual issues. She was using me for financial security, and I was using her to feel like the dangerous man I used to be. But neither of us was actually becoming anything. We were just existing in a fantasy that got more expensive and less satisfying every day." Tara processed this information with the analytical skills that had made her one of the most sought-after marketing strategists in the city. "When did it end?" "Officially? 6 months ago, when she started seeing someone else. Another wealthy man who could give her what she needed while being less complicated about it." His smile was rueful rather than bitter. "Unofficially? It ended the first morning I woke up next to her and realized I felt more alone than I ever had in our marriage, even during our worst moments." "And what do you want from me now?" "Absolution, forgiveness, permission to feel better about the choices that destroyed everything we built together. I want you to know that you were right about everything," he said with the humility of someone who'd been comprehensively wrong. "About our marriage, about what real love looks like, about the difference between partnership and performance. I want you to know that I understand now what I was too selfish and immature to see then." "Which is what?" "That excitement isn't the opposite of love. It's what love feels like when you're brave enough to keep choosing the same person, even when familiarity makes it easier to take them for granted. He paused, gathering courage for what came next. And that the most dangerous thing I ever did wasn't sleeping with another woman. It was convincing myself that being grateful for love was somehow less valuable than being desperate for it. The insight was profound enough that Tara felt a flicker of the intellectual connection that had first drawn them together. But intellectual compatibility wasn't enough to rebuild trust that had been demolished by betrayal. "I'm glad you learned those lessons," she said sincerely, "but learning them cost you everything you claimed to value most. Some education is too expensive to be worth the price." "I know," he said quietly. "I'm not here asking for another chance. I'm here because I needed you to know that your love wasn't wasted on someone too stupid to appreciate it. It was the most valuable thing I'll ever receive, and I destroyed it because I confused abundance with limitation. Why does that matter to you? My opinion of whether your regret is sufficient? Because you were the best part of my life for 7 years, and I need to know that you don't hate the memory of loving me." The vulnerability in his voice reminded her of the man she'd fallen for, not the successful mogul, but the uncertain boy underneath who'd always needed more validation than he'd been comfortable requesting. But sympathy wasn't the same as reconciliation, and understanding wasn't the same as forgiveness. "I don't hate the memory," she said honestly. "I treasure what was real about our love, and try not to dwell on what was performed. But Marvin, those memories belong to people we used to be. The woman standing here today wouldn't have married the man who asked permission to cheat, and the man you've become wouldn't have needed that permission in the first place. So there's really no possibility of—" "No," she said gently but firmly. "Not because I'm cruel or unforgiving, but because I've built a life I love with someone who's never made me question my worth. I won't trade that security for the possibility of recapturing something that was never as healthy as we pretended it was." Marvin nodded, accepting defeat with more grace than she'd expected. "Then I hope he appreciates what he has in you. And I hope you never let anyone make you feel like you have to choose between being loved and being yourself." "I won't," she said with certainty that came from hard-won self-knowledge. "I've learned the difference between love that expands you and love that contains you. I'll never accept the second kind again." As she watched him leave through her glass walls, Tara felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. Not the satisfaction of revenge or the triumph of proving her worth to someone who'd underestimated her, but the quiet certainty that she'd made choices that honored both her past and her future. The woman who'd once waited desperately for validation had evolved into someone who generated her own sense of worth and shared it generously with people who'd never asked her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. The reckoning wasn't about Marvin finally seeing what he'd lost. It was about Tara finally understanding that some chapters of your life are meant to end so that better ones can begin, written by your own hand in ink that no one else can erase. But this wouldn't be their final encounter. The man who'd sacrificed everything for momentary desire had one last desperate gamble planned, one final attempt to prove that some love stories could survive even the most devastating betrayal. Whether redemption was possible or justice was absolute would be decided when desperation met the magnificent certainty of a woman who'd learned to author her own happy ending. The final confrontation would test everything both of them had learned about love, forgiveness, and the price of growing into who you're meant to be when the cost of that growth is losing who you used to be. Chapter 9. The Final Choice. The greatest love stories don't always end with lovers reunited. Sometimes they end with someone loving themselves enough to choose the life they deserve over the life they once thought they wanted. 2 years after walking out of her marriage, Tara Davis stood in her elegant Tribeca apartment, watching CNN report on a story that had shocked Manhattan's elite circles. Tech mogul Marvin Duran had liquidated his entire fortune, donating hundreds of millions to domestic violence shelters, women's entrepreneurship programs, and foster care organizations. In an unprecedented move, Mr. Duran has retained only enough assets to maintain a modest lifestyle, the reporter continued, stating that he wanted to support women rebuilding their lives after devastating losses. Tara muted the television, recognizing Marvin's calculated psychology, even in apparent philanthropy. At 32, she'd learned to see through grand gestures to the motivations beneath. Her doorman's voice crackled through the intercom. "Miss Davis, there's a Marvin Duran in the lobby. He says it's urgent and final. Send him up in 10 minutes, she said, needing time to prepare for whatever desperate gambit he'd planned. She'd built more than a business in these 2 years. She'd built an identity that belonged entirely to her. The apartment around her reflected authentic choices rather than compromises, filled with bold artwork, books she'd chosen for herself, and photographs of achievements that were hers alone. When the knock came, soft and hesitant, she opened the door to find Marvin transformed by loss and self-examination. At 34, he looked like a man who'd been systematically rebuilt from different materials. Humbler, more genuine, but carrying the weight of consequences that showed in every line of his face. "Hello, Tara," he said, holding divorce papers and the anniversary necklace like relics from another life. "I saw the news about your donations," she said, stepping aside to let him enter. "Very dramatic. It wasn't drama. It was education." He sat heavily on her couch, looking around her space with something approaching awe. "I needed to understand what it felt like to have nothing so I could finally appreciate what I'd destroyed when I had everything." "And what did you learn?" "That I'd spent my entire adult life trying to prove I deserved good things instead of just being grateful when they arrived." His voice caught slightly. "I learned that your love was the most valuable thing I'll ever possess, and I destroyed it because I was too insecure to believe I deserved it." Before Tara could respond, James's key turned in her door. She'd given him one 3 months ago, a gesture that had terrified and thrilled her in equal measure. He appeared carrying wildflowers and wearing the smile that had never once made her question her worth. "Am I interrupting something?" James asked, taking in the scene with calm assessment rather than jealousy. "James, this is Marvin," Tara said simply. "Marvin, James." "The architect," Marvin said, rising to shake hands. "I've read about your community housing projects. They're genuinely impressive." "Thank you," James replied. "Your AI work has always been remarkable too." The civility between them was surreal. 2 men who understood that the woman they both cared about held all the power in this moment. "I came to apologize," Marvin said, turning back to Tara, "and to ask if you think it's possible for someone to change fundamentally enough to deserve what they destroyed through their own stupidity." "People can change," Tara said thoughtfully, "but they can't undo consequences. You can become better, but you can't become someone who never broke my trust." "I know, but Tara..." He struggled with words, no longer the articulate businessman, but a man fighting for something he'd learned too late to value properly. "What if I told you I finally understand that love isn't about finding someone who makes you feel complete, that it's about being whole enough that when you choose someone, it's to add joy instead of fill emptiness?" "That's beautiful insight," she said gently, "but learning it cost you everything you claim to value most." "Then let me spend my life proving I've learned it. Let me show you that losing you taught me how to love selflessly instead of selfishly." James had moved to the window, giving them space while making his presence felt, a contrast that wasn't lost on any of them. One man desperate for another chance, another secure enough to trust her judgment. "Marvin," Tara said with gentle finality, "I'm glad you've grown. I hope you find someone who gets to benefit from all that wisdom. But I've built a life with someone who never needed to learn how to cherish me. So there's no chance. Nothing I can do or become that would earn me another opportunity to love you properly. You can love the next woman properly from the beginning," she said kindly. "But I won't trade the security I found with James for the possibility of teaching someone else how to value me." Marvin nodded, accepting defeat with dignity that would have been impossible 2 years ago. As he reached her door, he turned back. "I want you to know," he said quietly, "that watching you become this powerful, successful woman, it's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed, even though it breaks my heart that I can't be part of it." "You were part of making it necessary," Tara replied, "and I'm grateful for that, even though it wasn't your intention." After he left, James wrapped his arms around her from behind. "Any regrets?" he asked softly. "Only that it took betrayal to teach me my own worth," she said, leaning against his warmth. "But not about choosing this life, choosing you. And now I know that the greatest love story isn't about forgiveness or second chances," Tara said, turning to face him. "It's about recognizing love that was right from the beginning and never letting anyone convince you to settle for less." Outside, Marvin drove through Manhattan in his modest car, finally understanding that wisdom earned through destroying what you love most is wisdom that comes too late to matter. But inside her apartment, Tara smiled as she took James's hand, walking toward a future built on the solid foundation of loving herself first and choosing someone who'd understood her worth from the moment they met. Some love stories end with forgiveness. The best ones end with a woman powerful enough to choose happiness over history, growth over grief, and love that celebrates her exactly as she is, over love that had to learn her value through loss. Chapter 10. The Choice. The greatest love stories don't always end with lovers reunited. Sometimes they end with someone loving themselves enough to choose the life they deserve over the life they once thought they wanted. Tara opened her door to find Marvin standing in the hallway, holding divorce papers and the anniversary necklace like relics from a life that felt like ancient history. At 34, he looked like a man who'd learned expensive lessons about the difference between wanting someone and deserving them, but the education had come at a cost that showed in every line of his face. "I saw the news," she said without preamble. "The donations. Very impressive." "It wasn't for show," he said quietly, though they both knew that everything Marvin did carried an element of calculation. "I needed to understand what it felt like to have nothing, so I could finally appreciate what I'd destroyed when I had everything that mattered." "And what did you learn from poverty?" "That I'd spent my entire adult life trying to prove I deserved good things instead of just appreciating them when they arrived." He met her eyes with the directness of someone who'd finally stopped performing emotions he thought others wanted to see. "I learned that the most valuable thing I ever possessed was your love, and I destroyed it because I was too insecure to believe I deserved it unconditionally." Behind her, she could hear James moving quietly through her apartment, giving her space to handle her past while making his presence known. The contrast between the two men was everything. One begging for another chance, the other secure enough in their relationship to trust her judgment completely. "Why are you here, Marvin?" she asked, remaining standing while he sat heavily on her couch like a supplicant seeking an audience with someone whose forgiveness could absolve years of regret. "Because I needed you to know that I finally understand the difference between gratitude and love, between partnership and possession, between appreciating someone and taking them for granted. His voice gained strength as he spoke. And because I wanted to ask if you think it's possible for someone to change fundamentally enough to deserve a second chance at something they destroyed through their own stupidity. People can change, Tara said thoughtfully, but they can't undo the consequences of who they used to be. You can become a better man, but you can't become a man who never betrayed his wife's trust. James appeared in the doorway then, wearing the charcoal suit he'd chosen for their evening celebrating his latest community project. At 35, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd built his identity around creating meaningful work rather than accumulating impressive possessions. "James, this is Marvin," Tara said with the calm efficiency of someone comfortable with her past and confident in her future. "Marvin, James." "I followed your architectural work," Marvin said, rising to shake hands with surprising grace. "The affordable housing projects are genuinely impressive, solving real problems instead of just creating beautiful buildings." "Thank you," James replied evenly. "Your AI innovations have always been remarkable. Even after everything, I respect what you built professionally." The civility between them was almost surreal. Two men who understood that the woman they both loved held all the power in this moment, and that demanding or manipulating would only prove they didn't deserve her consideration. "Tara," Marvin said, turning back to her with desperate honesty, "I know I have no right to ask this. I know I shattered something irreplaceable and spent 2 years learning lessons I should have understood before I hurt you. But is there any possibility that you could consider trying again? Not to recapture what we had, but to build something better from the people we've become." "Based on what?" Tara asked, genuinely curious about his reasoning rather than moved by his desperation. "Based on the fact that losing you taught me how to love selflessly instead of selfishly," he said with raw vulnerability. "Based on knowing now that partnership means supporting someone's dreams rather than absorbing them into your own. Based on understanding that the most dangerous thing I could do isn't cheating on you. It's appreciating you so completely that I never take a single day of your love for granted. You learned to love properly by destroying someone who already loved you properly," Tara said with devastating accuracy. "That's character development, Marvin, but it doesn't entitle you to benefit from the education." "Then let me spend the rest of my life proving I understand the difference between earning love and expecting it," he pleaded. "Let me show you that some people can learn from their mistakes completely enough to never repeat them." Tara looked at this man who'd once been the center of her universe, then at James, who'd never asked to be anything more than a valued part of her expanded world. The choice should have been difficult. Love rebuilt from ashes versus love built on solid ground from the beginning. Instead, it was the easiest decision she'd ever made. "Marvin," she said with gentle finality, "I'm genuinely glad you learned to love authentically. I'm proud that you developed the emotional intelligence you lacked when we were married, and I hope you find someone who gets to benefit from all that growth. But not you. Not me." She moved toward her door, signaling that this conversation was ending. "Because I've built a life with someone who never needed to destroy my trust to learn how to cherish it. I won't trade that security for the possibility of teaching someone else how to love me properly. So this is really the end. This is really the beginning of your chance to apply everything you've learned with someone who hasn't already paid the price for your education." Marvin nodded, accepting defeat with dignity that would have been impossible 2 years ago. "Then I hope James knows what an extraordinary woman he has. And I hope you never let anyone make you question your worth again." "I won't," Tara said with certainty born from hard experience. "I've learned the difference between love that expands you and love that diminishes you. I'll never accept the second kind again. After he left, James wrapped his arms around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder as they watched through her windows while Marvin disappeared into the city night. "Any regrets?" James asked softly. "Only that it took betrayal to teach me I was worth more than I thought," Tara replied, leaning back against his solid warmth. "But not about choosing you, choosing this life, choosing myself first so I could love you better. And now I know that the greatest love story isn't about finding someone who completes you," she said, turning in his arms to face him. "It's about becoming so complete on your own that when love comes, it multiplies your happiness instead of creating it." James kissed her then, and Tara tasted the future on his lips, a future built on mutual respect, shared values, and the kind of love that had never required her to be anyone other than exactly who she was. Outside, Marvin drove through Manhattan in his modest car, finally understanding that some mistakes cost everything and that the price of wisdom is sometimes losing what you could have cherished if you'd been wise enough to recognize its value from the beginning. But in her apartment, Tara Davis smiled as she prepared for an evening celebrating love that had been built instead of rebuilt, partnership that had been earned instead of recovered, and the magnificent discovery that a woman who knows her worth will always choose the person who recognized it first over the person who had to lose her to learn it. The anniversary necklace would find its way to a charity auction where it would fund new beginnings for other women. But the woman who'd once worn it had already discovered that the most precious thing she could ever possess was the unshakable knowledge of her own worth and the wisdom to share her life only with people who'd understood that worth from the moment they met her. Some love stories end with forgiveness. Others end with justice. The best ones end with a woman powerful enough to choose happiness over history, growth over grief, and the love that celebrates her exactly as she is over the love that took betrayal to learn her true value. Tara Davis had written her own ending, and it was magnificent.